Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome you all here for the cost of conflict. We will have 4 speakers. First will be Roger Coupal of agricultural economics, and applied economics, excuse me. Then next will be Tom Foulke, who is also from Ag and Applied Economics. Then we'll have Thorsten Janus, who's here, who will be speaking from the Department of Economics at the College of Business. And then Neely Mahapatra, who is Professor of Social Work in Health Sciences. I am the person, just to our speakers, who will be doing this very technical thing of changing the slides. So when you're ready, please just say next, and I will do that. I wanted to begin with this one slide. This comes from a long time ago from the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And what it shows is that whichever way you look at it, the most expensive and riskiest venture is war. And I just wanted you to see that anything else is much less risky and much less expensive in terms of cost, in terms of human life, in terms of environmental damage. Anything you can think of, war is by far the most costly. So we'll begin with Roger Coupal, who will have to join us via Zoom. So I'll turn it to him. Roger, whenever you want the slide advanced, just let me know. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I'm hoping I'm not giving an echo. I'll try to ignore that. But, so what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about the link between trade, development, and improved migration, which is a big issue. Trade, for the World Bank, can cause decreased conflict and increased climate change or need solution. Trade goes both ways. Areas are much to maintain current pollution as they are to utilize and receiving it. Without expanded trade or conflict in the area, one is to trade, more households in low-income countries become more secure as a result of climate change and because of conflict. If you look at the graph, Human Development Index, the first time worldwide has declined. Now, most of that's COVID-19, but still, it's an important thing you have to consider. Conversion storms are right now, we'll talk a lot about, I think, in the next few minutes. And then the nature of what kind of migration is actually occurring. So, next slide.
Roger, I just want to say that your internet may be unstable. It's a little bit difficult to hear you. I just want to warn you, we can get much of it, but just to let you know. Any other thoughts?
He sits a little bit back from his computer.
Okay. I'll get a little closer then. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Okay, close. Great, thank you.
Okay, right. So what I see is there's conversion storms on households and the livelihoods of developing nations. And it's gotten worse over the past couple of decades. Conflict, both internal conflict as well as international or cross-country conflicts have been going continuously. Climate change, which we'll talk about, as well as COVID itself or disease in general. The rural-urban distinction, okay, I bring up because 4.3 billion people live in urban areas. It's 55% of the world population. And urban growth overtook growth in 2009 and is amplified since then. What you have is a different set of skill sets, different language abilities, and also ultimately different adjustments. So next slide. So this is kind of a map I found on conflict and peace building. What you've got here, conflicts are armed conflict in the red. The orange is social political conflicts that are going on for generating or internal migration, and then the stripes are both. So worldwide in 2020, there were 32 armed conflicts, 98 social political crises, 37 of the are in exploratory peace processes, and 18 of the 32 armed conflicts have a gender-based connection. Next slide. So what does it look like? Well, the World Migration Report, this is 2020, okay? 60% of the what I would call livelihood migrants, they're looking for a source of income for their families. 40% of conflict migrants, and they're also looking for a source of security for their families. 135 million were in 2020 were female. A little added statistic that came from the Tier Justice Institute. Over 70% of the female migrants in the U.S. experienced gender-based or sexual abuse after arriving to the U.S. It's an important issue to consider. They're leaving and fleeing gender-based violence, and they're meeting gender-based violence. 141 million males. Over 70 countries rely on remittances for at least 4% of their GDP. 75% of the remittances are used to put food on the table. Next slide. I bring this up, again, this is old, but up until about 2020, Syria was by far the largest source of conflict migrants in the world, behind the Democratic Republic of Congo. And Ukraine was down in the top 20, but it wasn't near what it is now. As of July 2022, 5.6 million refugees. It's probably a lot more now. There's 8.8 million border crossings going on at the same time. The figure down below, I bring up primarily because there's a certain amount of permanence when it comes to a migrant, whether it's conflict or climate change. It doesn't make a difference. You know, when they move because they've got nothing where they were from, and they have less when they're on the road. New slide. Next slide. So conflict migration are kind of about the same, in terms of how it affects a number of people. Initial driver of migration may differ across population, countries, and contexts. But ultimately, what these people want is to provide security and adequate living conditions for their families and themselves. Food security is a critical push factor driving international migration. Income equality and poverty are others, but conflict and climate change are the two big ones, according to what I've read. Active migration itself causes food insecurity, and so that just adds to the problem. Persistent droughts and land degradation contribute to both seasonal and permanent migration. The number of climate-related disasters tripled in 30 years, according to Oxfam. By 2030, large parts of Central Africa and East Asia will experience greater exposure to droughts, floods, and tropical storms. 20 million people are internally displaced by extreme weather disasters in the last decade. 80% live in Asia. 10% of the people produce about half the global emissions. The poorest 50% are responsible for 10% of the global emissions. Between 2008 and 2018, 18 African countries have collectively suffered annual losses over $700 million. Just as a summary, without trade and without the development that comes with and amplifies trade, okay, or conflict barriers and expanded development, the more households in lower countries will become more food insecure as a result of the conflict and climate change, and the more developed countries will be dealing with migration. Developed countries will be dealing with migration at our borders. So that's a pretty negative perspective, but right now migration has its issues. Thank you.
Sorry about that. They can hear us, but they can't see us, unfortunately. Thanks, Robert.
just pause, we should point out that there are refreshments at the back of the room because we know it's late on Friday afternoon. So please do help yourself. And then there's reception outside afterwards.
My apologies, we just realized online that no one can see us. Very sorry for our Zoom audience. Unfortunately, the cameras are not working on the lectern. So unfortunately, you will not be able to see us, but you will be able to hear us and watch the slides. And we do have a recording of this event, so if you feel like you would like to get off now, that is fine, but we will happy to share everything with our recording later on.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce Tom Foulke.
Thank you. So we could probably talk all day about what's happening with food insecurity and what's happening with prices, what's happening with inflation and everything, but I'm going to really focus down and just talk about wheat. So it's emblematic of what's happening in the world as far as insecurity, prices, everything else. So next slide, please. To start out with a little graph, this is from the Chicago Board. I can't see it because of the thing. Chicago Auction Exchange. This is the price of wheat, the futures price of wheat. This is the global representation of what wheat is selling for now. So this goes from September to September last year. And as this graph starts, it looks like it's low and then it goes up. It's actually about double where it had been trading in the last decade. So it already come up at the end of the pandemic. There are already supply shortages of truck drivers, shortages of people to process and things like that. So the price was already elevated going into last year, the end of last year. And then you can see in March there, Russia invades. And everybody went, holy crap, look what's happening, okay? And we have that big spike there. And then people kind of settled down and said, well, we're not so sure this is really, it's bad, but we're not so sure it's really bad. It's gonna last only so long and everything. And then all of a sudden, they started looking at what the rest of the world's doing and realizing that there's not a lot of grain out there. And there's people that are gonna be starving. And so back in June, we were talking about how hundreds of millions of people in Africa would be starving, okay? And so, back to that one. So what happened was we had this record high back in June. And then all of a sudden we had the Black Sea Grain Initiative where Russia said, okay, we'll let Ukraine export some grain. And so once that started, prices went down and they're a little bit elevated from where they were. I just want to make a point that globally, every year, about 765 million tons of wheat alone, I'm not talking about corn, barley, or anything else, wheat alone is grown. And a lot of that's for feed as well. Okay, next one. So why is it so important? Well, Russia and Ukraine have been traditionally known as the breadbaskets of Europe, so lots and lots of grain grows there. So between the two of them, let me get my notes here, between the two of them, they're both in the top 5, but between the two of them, during 2021, they represented about $12 billion worth of revenue for the sales, and about 21%. So about a quarter of the exported grain. This doesn't count what people grow and save at home. This is about the export, about the trade. About a fifth of the, and usually about a quarter of the trade is from Russia and Ukraine. You can see that. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is kind of a complicated one. Shows that some countries, it's not just about the amount, but it's about where it comes from. It's not just about supply, it's about distribution, getting the food to the people that need it, okay? So the red shows you Russia had about $10 billion worth of exports, and Ukraine had about 4.5, and these are where they go. This is where it went. So the important thing I want you to see this here is kind of Russia imports and Ukraine, percent of all wheat imports. So Egypt is a country of about 103 million people. A third of it lives in poverty. And they get 86% of their grain from Russia and Ukraine. Okay? And then you look down here at Pakistan. What do we have happen in Pakistan? We had a flood, and now we have a lot of disease there. And they get 88% of their grain from Russia and Ukraine. So distribution becomes a really critical element, where it comes from. Not just somehow that hole needs to be filled. Okay? Next slide, please. So Russia's, not only is it just the grain itself, but also the means to grow it. So you can see here that Russia is the largest exporter of nitrogen-based fertilizer. Russia is the second largest exporter of potash. Russia is the third largest exporter of phosphates. So all of these things come from Russia. All right? Then there's the fact that diesel fuel in Europe is costing around $9 a gallon right now, converted. All right? My little note at the bottom there, some of it has changed. I did miss that. Russian agricultural products are not embargoed. They are free to go out. Okay? However, for a while there, no ships wanted to go in because they couldn't get the insurance. All right? So once they made the grain deal, they were able to come out. So now, now ships are able to leave. So here's some, I'm going to call them fun facts. All right? So this is a couple of articles. In the first 7 weeks since the Russian grain deal, or the Black Sea Grain Initiative went, there were about 4.4 million tons left Crimea, or not Crimea, Odessa, okay? And that's about 20% of last year's harvest. So in the 7 weeks, they've got about a fifth of it out, which means you got to multiply that times 5 before it's going to be done. So another 30 weeks before all of last year's harvest can even get out of there, okay? That was 182 ships left Odessa, okay? The ships, and take another 6 to 7 months to get it out of there, and another 650 more ships need to leave there if that initiative holds long enough. So just to get last year's crop out is going to take another 5 to 6 months. Okay, and the new crop's in, it's 41% down from where it was, obviously, because part of Ukraine is now under Russian control, and the Russians are taking a lot of Russian grain, or Ukrainian grain, shipping it on their own. Remember, there's no embargo on Russian grain. They can send as much as they want out, okay? And it's down 41%. So what has been shipped out, these loads I'm talking about, half of it is corn. It's not wheat that needs to go to Africa, it's corn. And most of that corn has been going to Europe to feed. Okay, for feed crop for animals, livestock, okay? About half of the shiploads have gone to Europe. Of that 4.4 million tons, half of those shiploads have gone to Europe. A quarter of them went to the Mideast, North Africa, and an eighth of them went to sub-Saharan Africa. Okay? So there's been a little bit of disconnect about where this grain should go. So it's not just getting out, it's where it goes. It's important. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so this first one, I'll read it out. It says, predicted crisis supply has so far not materialized. Predictions of widespread famine have not occurred yet. I just saw the front page of the Wall Street Journal that said that there's 395 million people in the world that are under food insecurity right now. Okay, so these issues of supply and food availability are still with us, very much so. Okay, this kind of follows on what's been happening. This grain corridor did occur. I mean, if Vladimir anytime wants to shut this down, you know, he could do that very easily. It could stop, and no one's noticed. So Russia continues to export its own grain and the Ukrainian grain that's effectively stolen. Okay? So the real issue now for many people and many countries in sub-Saharan Africa is not just the availability, it's also the price. Okay, getting the amount of food that they need and at the right price. Because many of these countries, the government subsidizes grain. Egypt especially subsidizes grain heavily. So what that means is that they're having to pay a lot more. And what does this do? It has a knock-on effect of social destabilization. Okay? So that's a really big issue that's going forward that we're going to see in the next year or so. Next slide, please. Okay, last slide. You know, we here have plenty to eat. We think everything's kind of okay. But this came out from the USDA as of the 1st from the USDA. I got this off of Bloomberg. Next year, or this year actually, the Department of Agriculture is predicting that the cost of growing is going to go up 18%. So almost a fifth Okay, the costs are growing. What do you think that's going to do to your grocery bill? Do you think those farmers are going to eat that 18%? Do you think the companies that produce your food are going to eat that 18% so you can have cheap food? No, they're going to pass it on as much as they can to you, maybe a little more because they expect inflation to be going up. So if you can see here what the big numbers are, it's feed, fertilizer, labor, those are the big things, the big cost drivers that are going up this year. So watch your grocery bill, keep your pennies close because the price of things are going to continue to go up. Okay? And that's all I have.
Professor Thorsten Janus, Department of Economics.
This is just to... Thank you. Yeah, so this presentation is called Who Benefits from Conflict, and while the panel is called or the cost of conflict, I thought it was important to ask who has to benefit from, or who benefits from conflict, because why do conflicts start? Next slide. Yes. And so the conflict is costly for the world as a whole, and for civilians. Major conflicts probably just don't just happen. They usually happen because somebody thinks they're a good idea, and so if we, from a policy perspective, if we can decrease the perceived or actual benefits of conflict, we might be able to prevent them. Next slide. And so how can anyone benefit from conflict? And then I put, you might have seen the classical prisoner's dilemma from game theory. But as one example, if you have no one to guarantee your security, it might be tempting to attack your opponent before they attack you. So you can, in that game theory, from the game theory perspective, 0 exceeds -1, and so attacking is better than don't attacking, and 2 exceeds 1. So attacking is like a dominant strategy. So it's like attack. And this is too simplistic because most people and countries coexist peacefully. We always read about conflicts, but the vast majority of countries and individuals live peacefully. So this is too simplistic. But nonetheless, I think it captures the fundamental uncertainty. If either within or between countries, nobody can guarantee your security. In developed countries, we have the U.S. or the police force and a legal system and military defenses, and so we kind of like we can walk around like security and not worry too much about security, but if you are Ukraine and neighboring Russia, or if you're in a country where the government is inept or corrupt, then you don't have the same security guarantees, and you kind of have to worry. And vengeful or optimistic politicians, they can often exploit this insecurity by playing on people's fears and manipulating information. So you can, so next slide.
Would you prefer to stand here so the light's not hanging out?
Okay, yes, please. Next slide, sorry. Thanks. There is literature, the academic literature on rational conflict. And so the academic literature generally suggests that conflict can be rational if resources are finite, which they largely always are. And for example, the opponents have different information, and then you're kind of like willing to increase your resource demands, even if it increases your risk of conflict. You're kind of, you're trying to like demand a little bit more resources, a little bit more land, a little bit more money, like, they're trying to push it. And then you might risk conflict, but it's like a trade-off. And sometimes you're going to get conflict because the opponent is going to react with violence instead of conceding. And then a second source of conflict is if the opponents expect the relative power balance to change, and then you kind of want to prevent the power shift by subduing the opponent. If a country or and a certain grouping within a society is going to grow stronger compared to your own grouping or your own country, you might want to strike before they get too strong. You might want to subdue them. Third, the leadership characteristics in democracies and autocracies might differ. There's some. It's usually easier for autocrats to start a war because they have the power and they don't have to get congressional approval, democratic approval, and they can sacrifice people. They're just like there's a counterpart. And values and identities and belief might matter regardless of material resource shares. And so if you feel marginalized or politically excluded, even if you have a reasonable resource share, a reasonable consumption, you might start wars as well, or you might express dissatisfaction as well. So. Can war be profitable? Once conflicts begin, the conflicts can empower governments because they can call like a state of emergency and increase their power. And usually, when there's a war, civilians get most people get scared and they kind of like support the government because you have to support the strong party. Whoever can protect you, you're going to flock to them and support them. So conflicts tend to empower governments and militaries, and in civil wars, rebel leaders and warlords, because the civilians look for protection. Another reason war can be profitable is that high and low level combatants can tax and loot and extort and kidnap and smuggle, use illegal drugs and extract natural resources like diamonds and minerals and timber and gemstones and stuff like that. So this can keep the conflict going because war is kind of good business. The people with guns can make it a good business and keep the conflict going. A third reason, foreign governments like the superpowers and other countries, Iran, Russia, and now the EU, US, and Ukraine, and private consumers, corporations, and financial institutions can also fuel conflict. In the case of Ukraine, I think I think it's good, but I mean it's good that the Western countries support Ukraine, but it probably does prolong the conflict, opportunities can kill or report their neighbors to the enemy. In the fog of war, people can lie and say that the neighbor, their neighbor supports the rebel group or the government or something like that, and then they can take their land and their money and their wealth, or sell all the grudges. Human rights violators can hide among civilians and refugees, who can be stolen. But the point is, war can be profitable for kind of like people with guns or opportunists, kind of. So that's like I call it the benefits of early conflict prevention. So if you, I think it may be too. There's a point after which it's almost too late to stop a war. So preventing the rise of Nazi Germany might need to have started after World War I. The opposite of the Versailles Treaty. and many countries, Colombia, like I put it, like Colombia, Iraq, Kosovo, Lebanon, Rwanda, Syria, and Sri Lanka, may be peaceful right now, but they haven't resolved many of their structural problems, and I don't know if conflict is going to erupt sooner or later again, but if you settle war at all costs, or settle war but don't resolve the structural problems, there's a risk of recurrence. So reducing the benefits of violence is a long-term project. So I think that's all I had. Oh yeah, I was going to quote. I just saw this news article yesterday or 2 days ago, but it's from Reuters on the Colombian peace process. So it's just to illustrate that if you don't address the structural problems,
Okay, so before I start my presentation, I would just like to say that I'm not going to share any individual account of sexual violence or violence, but it's going to be part of my presentation. So if anyone feels uncomfortable, you can definitely step out of the auditorium. Just needed to say that. So my first slide, I thought I would, second one, start with the definition, because human trafficking, we know the definitions are very important with human trafficking, because there's always a lot of confusion with human trafficking and prostitution, and human trafficking and smuggling. So I'll just let you guys spend a few seconds to just read through this definition, which has been given by the TVPA, which is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. Time, just a few seconds. So as you can see, there's like sex trafficking, and there's also labor trafficking in it somewhere. And what is important in this slide is the stress on 3 different words, which is force, fraud, or coercion. So that needs to be there in order to be somebody, be a victim of human trafficking. But if you are under 18, that need not be there, simply because a child cannot consent to be participating in sex trafficking. Similarly, a youth can be a victim of trafficking if, regardless of if he or she, they have been transported to an exploitative place or situation, or if they have previously consented to work with the trafficker, or they have committed crime within that traffic situation. So I thought this was extremely important for us to understand. Thank you. Next. So these are some global estimates. Again, I'll give you just a few seconds to go through this. A lot of numbers. And numbers are very important with human trafficking, given that it's such a hidden population, because a human trafficking victim can be right in front of us and we won't know that they are victims of trafficking. Sometimes even the victims themselves don't know that they are victims of trafficking. So it's such a hidden population. So estimates, numbers are hard to get. Some of the important sources or credible sources to find some numbers are ILO, for example. So it's 50 million people who are living in modern day slavery, that sometimes human trafficking is referred to as. 28 million forced labor and 22 million in forced marriages. Mostly human trafficking victims are women and girls, but doesn't mean that it doesn't affect men and the boys. And if you look at the International Labour Organization estimation, it's actually $150 billion business or illegal profits a year. Out of that, $99 billion is generated from sex trafficking alone, and $51 billion from labor trafficking. And there's another estimate that actually says annual profits generated from victim is somewhere around $21,000 or $22,000 for sex trafficking, as compared to 4,800 victims trafficking for construction, manufacturing, mining, and utilities and so forth. And $2,500 for victims trafficked for agriculture, and then $2,300 for victims trafficked for domestic work globally. So numbers are very important. It tells you the scope of the problem or the issue. Thank you, Stephanie. Next. So, what are some of the factors that usually contribute to human trafficking? And these are some of the factors that is related to a conflict zone, usually a war or a civil war. So, for example, social and economic vulnerabilities. So there's completely no rule of laws. Like if you see, for example, the Ukraine right now, there's breakdown of state institutions, there's forced displacements. You can see that in numbers and millions in Ukraine right now. Children are displaced, they lose their parents. There's also discrimination against some minority groups, like for example, the Rohingya Muslim community or the Muslim groups in Burma. Then the breakdown of social ties, because people are moving. There are now, for example, 700 refugees who actually have moved out of Ukraine into different countries. So they lose all of those social ties. And there are other things also that contribute to human trafficking, usually in a conflict area, are competing priorities and reduced capacity. So for example, the prevention efforts are now reduced or totally gone. Awareness programs are, of course, suspended. No conversations about it among community leaders. Proper identification and screening are gone. Of course, law enforcement is busy doing something else. Anti-trafficking efforts have shifted now, and complete breakdown of infrastructure. And this is coming on the heels of a pandemic, just imagine. Especially Ukraine right now, where 8 million people have been displaced within the country and almost 7 million outside of the country. So, the other thing there is that the UN reports, or it actually explains that there are 3 trends in trafficking when it comes to conflict areas or wars. And the first one is trafficking within and into the conflict zone. So trafficking that takes place within the country or the conflict zone, and then people are trafficked out from outside of the country into the country. So that's one. The second is child trafficking, which is for a variety of purposes. Could be for domestic servitude, could be for sex trafficking, could be for child soldiers, and increasingly child suicide bombers. Then the last type of trend is the trafficking out and through the conflict zones. For example, that would include the large number of refugees. Okay, and also that would include that internally displaced people, and there also would include some number of irregular migrants who probably are passing through the conflict zone, trying to find some job opportunities. Next slide. So I'm going to break it down. So under the trafficking within and into the conflict zone and child trafficking, these are some of the places where different kinds of trafficking is happening around the world. So for example, Yazidi minority groups or the Kurds in Kurdistan, which is ISIS occupied, which is the Levant region, which include Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, and Jordan. So this actually ISIS grew only after the war, especially on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then it moved to Syria. So it is well into its second decade right now. It has completely destabilized that particular region, and that has definitely created a lot of situations for human trafficking. For example, in terms of sexual exploitation, AGD women are forced into something known as the chattel slavery, which means that the women are used as a property. So they exchange hands, they are sold, they are bought, they are given at will. So they end up actually doing domestic servitude. They also end up as sex slaves. And sometimes they are forced to marry the militants. And they don't leave the house, they live inside the house, they're not even allowed outside of the house. There's frequent pregnancies with them. Besides women and the girls, even the LGBT men and boys also have been forced to become militants themselves and suicide bombers. Another very unique situation of human trafficking that happens in that area is that they somehow fraudulently lure Western women to actually join ISIS. It's very interesting, and some of the advocacy group actually have advocated on behalf of those women because they're somehow fraudulently lured and they work for ISIS and they fight for ISIS. If they try to leave, they definitely face some direct consequences. The second is in West Africa, which is Boko Haram. Boko Haram is one of those terrorist organizations, and they actively advocate for enslavement of populations, including men, women, children, and boys. Women and girls in these areas are often forced into marriages with militants, and boys are often forced to become suicide bombers. The next is your Congo, which is rich in resources, natural resources. So the militia group actually forces people to work in the mines for tantalum, for gold, for diamonds and tins and others. And also Congo is very famous for producing child soldiers in thousands, very specific to that area. And Burma is again very unique. It's happening now because of the Rohingya Muslim community or the groups. Burma was under military rule for almost 50 years. It ended in 2016, but again there's so much unrest starting 2017. And it's also rich in natural resources. It's a site for pipelines for natural gas and oil, which actually which is taken from Andaman Sea and goes through Burma to China. So that's why it also has seen high rates of human trafficking. Men, women, and children have been subjected to forced labor. So they usually porter or they work at construction sites, farming, and they're also used. Children are used as soldiers also. Women and girls have been repeatedly, sexually exploited, and there are other groups like the Kachin and the Shah, minority groups who lack citizenship and also don't have any identity documents, and they often fall prey to human trafficking. And the other one I kept on mentioning was the Rohingya Muslim groups, and you must have heard about this so much because almost like more than 30,000 have now fled Burma, and they are refugees in Bangladesh, India, I think in Thailand and other countries, Malaysia also. So many of them have been trapped, interestingly, trapped in something known as trafficking camps in forests. And now these traffickers demand money and ransom for their release. And within that time, they're actually working on fishing boats in Thailand. So the next slide. So the next one is trafficking out and through the conflict zone. And one of the examples is Syria, where there has been unrest for such a long time, civil war that has led to a lot of thousands of people who are fleeing to neighboring countries like Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq, where they can't legally work. So they can't legally work, and that also has given rise to a lot of human trafficking cases. Many times what happens is that they are paying smugglers to be smuggled out of the country to Europe or some other place. But with human trafficking, many times it has been seen that once they have been smuggled out and have reached a destination country, that can any time be then turned into a human trafficking situation. They can be forced into labor or into sex trafficking, their documents are taken away, so that whole smuggling case turns into a human trafficking case, and which is happening also. Severe forms of exploitation have been seen in this particular area. Begging by children, turning children into beggars has also been a case in this area. At the same time, Moving on, Calais and Dunkirk. If you know Calais, Calais is in France, and there's a tunnel which connects Calais to UK, and it is a main lifeline for transportation, for food trucks, and for passenger. So a lot of criminal gangs operate there, and they are traffickers in refugee camps, and they sexually exploit a lot of youth who are traveling by themselves, and also force them to commit crimes in exchange of transportation to UK. The next is Gambia and Somalia. In those places also you see high rates because there are a lot of terrorist organizations, and they force children, and which is something known as pay as you go. So a lot of the children are moving from these countries to up north. So they pay or they work and to pay for their passage. And during that, they also can be exploited sexually. The next is in Kosovo and Libya, where you again have some civil war and unrest. And here civilians have been kidnapped, have been trafficked across border, and this is where you see organ trafficking. So they are trafficked into Albania, for example, they're trafficked into Italy, and then the organs are harvested. Almost done. And then the final one. So this is again in Ukraine. I won't go into detail, but this is more recent what's happening in Ukraine. 90% of people who are leaving Ukraine are women and children, very vulnerable to trafficking. Look at the last one. So some of the social impacts, I'll just let you read this because it takes a whole, because victims of trafficking definitely go through severe or excessive physical abuse, sexual abuse, and mental abuse. So these are some of the impacts on them. The loss of resources because they lose jobs and they're not able to hold jobs. Of course, there is no remittance for them. There's loss of migrant remittance also because of their status. And there's one more slide, and I'm just quickly going over, just let you read a little bit. Many struggle with alcohol, drug addiction, as well as economic security is threatened because they cannot even have stable employment. And additionally, they don't have marketable resume because they haven't held a job for a very long time. And it's also very difficult to work with them because many of them don't have legal immigration status and have language barriers. So what I mean to say is that these victims or survivors of human trafficking not only have immediate or short-term needs, they have many long-term needs. It takes years for them for social workers, for example, to work with them and to have a stable life. Thank you.
I'll ask the three of you to share the microphone.
Okay.
I'm going to take questions from the audience, and then when you answer, would you please repeat the question? First, yes, please. And will you say what your name is and what your affiliation is?
My name is Thorsten. I'm a political science senior, and my question is how effective are sanctions at lowering the perceived benefit of conflict? That's something I've been thinking about. There's been a lot of thought about how sanctions would apply in future conflicts. There's been a lot of concern about Taiwan, for example. And the truth is sanctions on China would hurt the Western economy much more than the sanctions that Russia has. So there's a lot of concern that there won't even be that many sanctions if China invades Taiwan.
I can say,
Would you repeat the question?
yes, I think how sanctions are effective in case of conflicts. In my case of
I think you have to repeat the question. So how effective are sanctions in preventing conflict?
In preventing conflict. So, UN definitely suggests that exploitation should be actually there in any ceasefire or peace accord. It has to be there. And one way to avoid sexual exploitation is actually having more sanctions.
I think sanctions are always a double-edged sword, because a lot of times they end up hurting civilians. What do you call smart sanctions, like targeted sanctions on either like the top leadership, for example, like Vladimir Putin or the oligarchs supporting him, or weapon sanctions, or if you in the 1990s there was a famous case of blood diamonds in West Africa that financed conflict. And so like sanctioning diamonds and say that diamonds have to be certified. Sanctions can work, but it is very difficult to avoid harming civilians. The people who collect the diamonds out of West Africa in the 90s, a lot of them was ordinary workers, and then you're just eliminating those jobs and those livelihoods.
Roger, did you want to say anything? The effectiveness of sanctions?
I'm having a hard time understanding the question.
So how effective are sanctions?
Well, sure. The sanctions, in my opinion, are not particularly effective, and usually there is much in the interest of the leadership in those countries as it is in the leadership of our country, because it's what you might call a collusion of interest sometimes almost. So I don't really find sanctions to be helpful. In the case of war, like between Ukraine and Russia, it's hard not to have sanctions. But don't assume that it's difficult to get out of sanctions. Or to get around sanctions. Sanctions are hard to be effective.
That's because they're hard to enforce. It's very often easy to get around. Other questions? Thank you so much. Please stand and say your affiliation.
I'm a student here at Axton. So, with the first World War, we kind of learned the lesson of the dangers of intervening too soon. In the Second World War, we kind of learned the opposite lesson of not intervening soon enough. So I was wondering, how do we square that circle? Where's the line of when we should intervene, when we shouldn't? And is one of those lessons more important than the other?
Please.
I couldn't help but think, so the question was, considering that the intervention into World War I was too early and World War II was too late, when should one intervene in war? And I was thinking, wow, it's an American asking that question, because the Americans waited 2 years before they got involved in World War I. And if you talk to the Brits, they're still pretty annoyed about that. So it's a political question, and so I can't give you a good answer. There isn't a scientific, we can't put that into an equation and say, okay, this is the optimal time to get involved, because let's just take World War II in Europe. September 1st, 1939, the Germans, the Nazis invaded from one direction and the Soviets from the other, and the country was gone. That's probably a good time to start the war, if you see what I mean. But it's very difficult. In terms of the question, when should the United States get involved? That's sort of a different thing. The U.S. It has the beauty of its geography to allow it to be isolated. When you consider Europe, 75% of Americans are of European descent. You might have noticed that when the Queen died, that it was for a whole week, all the flags were at half-mast. Interesting, considering we fought the war, a Revolutionary War against it. So it's difficult from an American perspective, and it all comes down to politics and what people are thinking and who's in power, and honestly political polarization. So it's an excellent question, and it really is, but each situation is unique according to the circumstances. I'm sorry, I can't do more for you. Yes.
I'm a freshman in international studies. Do you think that as Russia takes more aggressive actions in Ukraine and the US and other Western countries have started to use all the sanctions that they've had, that they will sanction Russian grain exports?
As things heat up, will the U.S. or will the allies, those against Russia, will they sanction grain exports? Well, first of all, I don't know. But if I was to speculate, I'd say no, because that just impacts other people that really need food. And that was the reason why the Black Sea grain initiative is sort of just to let grain get out. So helping people not starve in the world is a good thing. And so sometimes, it looks like the countries and parties have got together to say, all right, we'll let these things go. So that's my guess.
Roger, did you want to speak to that?
Well, yeah, I think I understood the question. It's, the reality is that we're a third party. We're the triangulator on this whole thing. That doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't be, but that's going to have to come down to the dialogue between Ukraine and Russia somehow. Otherwise, it's just going to keep going. But that's a tactical response as well. So I don't think there's really a good answer, if I understood the question well, about what our role is, except for trying to figure out how to turn this thing into a benefit for, at least for Ukraine, and not a permanent war.
Yeah, Neely and Thorsten, did you want to address that question?
No,
Okay, very good. Thank you. In the back, please.
I'm a computer science major, and I talked about the benefits of war, and I was just wondering, what are the benefits of them committing war crimes? Because it seems like they've been bombing a lot of cities, and it's been, making a lot of people mad, and it just seems to be more of like a net negative for Russia than a net positive. It doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know if you make some sense to that.
Sorry.
Just a little bit further away.
I'm sorry. I think one function of hurting civilians is to kind of break the enemy's morale, kind of, and in some cases it can also be for logistical reasons, like to prevent food supply or to prevent them from sheltering the soldiers, kind of the enemy soldiers. But yeah, I would say that. Do you want to add?
What was the question? I know the question.
What is the point of committing war crimes? How does that benefit the attacker?
I mean, just showing power with, especially in Russia, the rape has been used as a weapon of war. And there have been cases of women and girls being raped. Gang rape is happening right in front of their families, and they've been killed. It's a deliberate strategy that's been used by Russia and Ukraine, just to show how powerful they are and they can do anything.
It's also a good way to pay your unpaid soldiers. All right, so you have to keep in mind a lot of training goes into soldiers, and if you look at the Russians, they're not very well trained. That's something that's come out. So if you have untrained soldiers, they're probably not paid very well. Very often they're from rural areas. Part of this is called the spoils of war. So you have your soldiers go in and they rape and pillage. Now, when it comes to genocide, there's a real benefit to raping women, and that is because if they give birth to half ethnics, do you see what I mean? There's a question as to, this is something in Braveheart, is the problem with Scotland is there are too many Scots. And that was the idea of First Night, is that if you have English soldiers having sex with the women on their wedding night, right, you don't know who the father is, it's likely that they'll be half English, that way you actually get rid of the Scottish people. So it's beneficial in that way, exactly what was already said in terms of breaking the people down. Rape of Nanjing, there's some really horrible stories, but a lot of it just comes from poorly paid soldiers. And this is just considered the spoils of war. Anything you can steal, right? If you can rape, that's to your benefit. And an interesting thing in Ukraine, I don't know if you heard this, but some of the soldiers were stealing Apple products. And so people were looking for their AirPods, for example, on the Find My feature, in the iPhone. And so they could actually find Russian troop movements from that because the people stole the iPods and then they knew where they were. Yes.
Hi, I'm Katie Johnson. I'm an undergraduate studying international studies, Spanish and philosophy. And I just want to start off by thanking all of you for coming and sharing your expertise. We all learned a lot. So I have a couple of questions. So what are the most important steps to rebuild a conflict zone? Like what preventative measures can be taken to make sure that it doesn't fall back into chaos again? And do you have good and bad examples of each case?
So the question is, how do you rebuild after conflict?
Yeah, what
Are there
steps?
good steps? What are the good and bad examples of that? Thank you.
Beyond my agreement.
I can say something, but so it is a little bit beyond my expertise as well. The World Bank, for example, has a special division or special branch devoted to post-conflict zones because there are some very special challenges to ensure that the conflict does not break out again. I mean, I know that part of it is demobilizing like soldiers and providing jobs for them and providing livelihoods for them. There are a lot of people and there's a lot of guns around and a lot of unemployed youth, especially males that have been in conflict, and you kind of got to find some jobs for them or some kind of livelihoods, and then I'm sure establishing security and law enforcement and a legal system and building infrastructure. I would imagine that those are important.
Just add to what has just been said, especially in the context of human trafficking, building capacity is extremely important. But it's so far-fetched because, after the breakdown of infrastructure, it's very hard. But you can definitely have some early warnings, and that you could have volunteers lined up. You could have that. But again, you can never know how a war situation will turn out to be, right? But these are some things that I've read in a report in the UN that can be done to prevent some war crimes, especially human trafficking or exploitation of women. As also I had just mentioned that exploitation of women, children, or men and boys even should be there in ceasefire. It should be written because sometimes when the war ends, it's still that continues. Right, and then there should be in the ceasefire absolutely written off, and then and also talked about sanctions. I know sanctions probably won't be effective. We can see that with Russia, but again, there should be sanctions, especially with regards to exploitation of women and children.
Did you want to speak to that at all?
How do you rebuild? Is that?
Yeah, how do you rebuild?
Yeah, okay, all right. Yeah, sure. Truth is, we don't do that very good. That work very well, right? I mean, we talk about it, but it doesn't seem to happen happen well. And so I'm not sure. There's not a good answer for that, unfortunately, except that we have to really think about rebuilding those relationships in a way that in a country that doesn't take it doesn't go the wrong way. you know, and we did a very good job, you know, with rebuilding Europe, but that was more of an exception than anything else, I think. And so it's a tough challenge to try to figure out. Of course, the best thing is to not have war in the first place, but of course we can't do that. But it is an issue that we need to spend more time figuring out how you actually rebuild a society, because we get confused in the cultures of those countries that we're involved in, or Russia just doesn't really care because, well, you know, there's an ideology underlying what Putin is. I'm not sure what that is, but there's clearly an ideology, and so it ends just what it means, I think, for him. But it is an easy thing to figure out how you actually build a viable community as well as an economy. And you have to do first, and then maybe do the second. So, yeah, hard.
I can answer this question a little bit, and partly because it's exactly what I do, so I have an advantage over my colleagues here. So yes, it's all about rebuilding relationships. That's really rebuilding trust, and if you see that as the baseline. In fact, Anthony Giddens, a famous sociologist from Cambridge, he argues that trust is the foundation of all society, that we all feel comfortable enough just to sit in this room to trust each other. Maybe you didn't like your block your bike outside, we still feel it's okay. So from that, we have an excellent example of a terrible reconciliation, which is the Treaty of Versailles, which not only actively punished the Germans and really broke them economically, which led to the horrible inflation and the rise of Hitler, but it was written half by the French, who were basically Germany, die, die, die. You can tell which parts are in the Treaty of Versailles by how strong they are, and the ones written by Woodrow Wilson that says we have world peace, very contradictory. So that was an example of a very poor settlement. As Roger said, Europe was very successful after World War II, a very different perspective. The United States got involved. You can't do a Marshall Plan everywhere. But what was interesting was the idea of European integration, where they tried to build trust. The Americans were really at the forefront here of political science by getting the European countries to trust each other. Also have to give a nod to Jean Monnet, sorry up there. Yes, he's the father of European integration. However, I'd like to talk about Dr. Nevin Aiken, who teaches classes on comparative genocide and transitional justice. And so another thing that the Americans got right after World War II were the Nuremberg trials that actually used the legal system to expand human rights and the human rights regime across the world. Transitional justice, so if you're talking Treaty of Versailles and World War II, those are interstate conflicts, but I think a lot of times, despite Russia and Ukraine, we're talking about intrastate, and that's where we really need truth and reconciliation commissions. For interstate violence as well as intrastate, you have to negotiate a political settlement that everyone agrees is somewhat fair. Then you can have a very small number of peacekeepers who are there. The idea of a peacekeeper is you just have really like even a few dozen people who just say we're keeping this order. That helps to rebuild trust. And also to rebuild the relationship between the cities and the countryside, because if you don't have food, just going back to that, there's really no hope that way. The truth is we've actually advanced in this. People get depressed and they talk about war. I'll remind you that wars have gotten shorter every century. If you think back to the Crusades, it's a 1,000-year war, right? And then you have 100 years war, you remember that, 20 years war. Now wars are much shorter. The number of people who die are much smaller. The number of civilian deaths, much smaller. And that's because of accuracy of weapons and because of people taking human rights and protections on civilians so seriously. So I would say even though it feels really depressing right now, I'm telling you there are fewer people in poverty today than 20 years ago. There are fewer instances of war today than there were 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. So there has been progress.
Can I just add, thanks, Deb. At a very micro level, because since I'm a social worker, because as Stephanie mentioned, which is very important in terms of building trust. especially working with human trafficking victims. So it has to be very victim focused, very trauma informed focused also. Because even UN has specified right now there should be protection of refugees, refugee centers all over, right? For example, you have refugee centers in Poland now for Ukrainians or in Russia. Is imperative. It's extremely important right now to protect them so they further don't fall into human trafficking or something else.
So we're actually bringing up the last slide, and I'm going to take the privilege of actually not asking the last question and not requesting an answer, because I think we're getting toward a really helpful set of answers, but toward posing a question for us all as we go out to a reception outside. I don't want to stand between your food. So, and we're really glad to have you here this late afternoon. But what I see on the stressing side, right, is that we've posed, sketched out what a vicious cycle looks like, right? Which is, we start with the nitrates, right? And then that's the ability to access food, the cost of food, and so on, just keeps getting worse. And then you have a collapse of a government because of the lack of food. Then you have the movement of populations. Then you have all the things that come with that in terms of trafficking and so on. And we've talked powerfully, I think, about how do you rebuild. But perhaps another question is, how do you interrupt? And I keep coming back in my own head to that question of food and how often it is the basis of human strife and so on. So with that said, I want to thank Stephanie Anderson and Roger Coupal online and Thomas Foulke from Agriculture and Economics, Thorsten Janus from Economics, and Neely Mahapatra from Health Sciences. And I hope you'll join me in thanking them for all their work today. I want you to invite you all to the reception and also to our next event, which will be Thursday, October 13th. And it's a celebration of our Fulbright and International Scholarship. And we really hope you will be with us. And we hope that those of you who have had Fulbrights will come and be celebrated. And those of you who might apply, which is everybody in the audience, should come and join us on the 13th.
Thank you.